Gun homicides are an epidemic in this country. We talk to our expert on staff about how to address the root causes and drive down gun deaths in impacted communities. Right now on CSGV at Home. Hello and welcome to CSGV at Home. My name's Andrew Patrick and I am the Director of Political Communications at the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. I want to thank you for joining us. We are in the middle of Wear Orange Week and we are talking today with our Director of Outreach and Equity at CSGV and the Educational Fund, Lauren Footman. Lauren, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Andrew.
So when we talk about Wear Orange and Gun Violence Awareness Month, one thing that we focus on here at CSGV and as a movement, gun homicides that impacted communities, basically Black and Brown Americans who are disproportionately affected by gun violence. The rates for a young African-American male to die from gun homicide is astronomical compared to their white counterparts. Can you tell us a little bit about the work at CSGV and the Ed Fund in impacted communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the Ed Fund and CSGV, we work with those disproportionately impacted by homicide, which, as you said, are Black and Brown communities. And so we recognize that there is a ongoing disinvestment historically and contemporarily in communities of color that drive the root causes of violence, such as lack of access to quality jobs, public housing, social services, quality public education. And so because of that historical disinvestment, which creates structural inequities, it perpetuates gun violence. And so structural inequities mixed with unregulated guns that get into communities disproportionately impacted by gun violence is a recipe for disaster. And so unfortunately, a lot of the root causes have been exacerbated by the other public health pandemic that we are dealing with, COVID-19. And so we at the Ed Fund for the last 8 years have been intentionally working with communities of color to ensure that they are at the forefront of the policy decisions and programmatic decisions that impact their communities, recognizing that they are the experts of their own communities and realities. And so what we do is create community advocacy networks, which are made up of survivors, allies, elected officials, and others who really care about addressing gun violence in communities of color, to coalesce around policy decisions and educate others in the community around the public health approach to reduce gun violence, because we at the Ed Fund and Coalition believe that we need to use the twin lenses of public health and equity to ensure that the policy recommendations that we are recommending don't disproportionately impact communities that we are trying to help and, of course, end up with unintended consequences.
So in building up these communities, building up these action networks, what states are we in? Like, so people who don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have been in Virginia for quite some time and definitely work with our executive director and our senior director of advocacy, Lori Haas, really thinking about how communities are a part of our grassroots and grass tops approach. And then we also have expanded to do work in spaces like Tennessee, particularly Nashville, in the last year and a half, and then also provide technical assistance to our great state partners in Minnesota and also Wisconsin and Pennsylvania.
Okay, I mean, it's wonderful. It's important work. And as you talk about these root causes, these structural inequities that have been built in for decades, really centuries long, of just not investing in communities, you don't have access to affordable housing or good jobs or good public education or healthy food, and you're just laying a gun on top of that. So without those opportunities, it just drives and exacerbates the gun violence epidemic in these communities. So in addressing these root causes, what are some of the things that our organization, but also our government and really our society can do to help address these inequities that have been really ingrained for far too long?
Yeah, absolutely. So our area of expertise is definitely looking at the public health approach to reducing gun violence. But as you said, the social the structural and social inequities that have existed are definitely a part of our fight. And so working to, number one, amplify and support the communities that are most impacted. And then on top of that, making sure that we are working in a broad coalition. So working with organizations that are addressing those structural inequities on an ongoing basis. And then where our area of expertise particularly is looking at intervention and prevention programs that can be funded at the federal, state, and local levels, because we recognize that data has shown us that if these programs that are evidence-based are funded continuously and consistently 3 to 5 years, making sure that it's social service focus can definitely have a great impact in reducing gun violence. And then also a part of our approach is also looking at the access to firearms and regulating firearms. And so I think that what we need to do, especially as we approach a year of the conversations around social justice and racial equity, is making sure that the communities who are being adversely affected are always a part of the policy decisions and always a part of the funding conversations. So we are making sure that not only are we bringing our lens, but again, recognizing that they are the experts of their own communities. And so it's really important for organizations such as ours to use our platform that we have is to amplify those most impacted, and then also making sure that the policies and programs that we're supporting are not having disparate impacts.
Yeah, it's not coming in telling these communities, hey, we're a national gun violence prevention organization, we're going to tell you how to make things work. It's listening to them, seeing what resources they need, seeing what assistance they need, providing it, and letting them build up their communities, build these networks that you're talking about of local leaders. And that's what's going to drive change. That's what's going to drive change at the local and state level, and even the federal level. So you mentioned the VIP funding, the violence interruption programs that have been, President Biden's touting them, several states. We mentioned Tennessee. We talked with Sierra about how Nashville and Knoxville have done it at the local level. They're looking to do it at the state level too. Virginia's put in a good amount of money into their budget for these types of programs. So what is this funding type of funding? How is it helpful in addressing gun violence?
Yeah, absolutely. So we recognize that gun violence, all types of gun violence, is a multifaceted issue. And so there are the root causes and social determinants of health. And so that's our long-term strategy. But we already have pockets of individuals in these respective communities that are already caught up in the cycle of violence. And so with using procedural just policing and looking at who are the individuals that are already in these systems of violence, we can then do targeted outreach and interventions to hopefully curb the violence and break those cycles of retaliatory violence. And so, we look at our work as a three-pronged approach. We recognize that, again, it's the root causes, but at the same time, people and communities are saying, well, what are we going to do now? We see gun violence is spiking in our communities. What's the immediate solution? And so the immediate solution is staying consistent with funding these evidence-based programs. Oftentimes when cities are able to get their homicide and violence rates down, they sometimes can reduce the funding and reduce the emphasis on these necessary programs. But what I think we've learned in recent years is that we need to consistently fund these programs because it's a pendulum. And so if we're not continuously making sure that we're doing this intentional outreach for this small percentage of individuals driving violence in our metropolitan cities, we'll be back at the same place. And so it's great that, as you mentioned, respective cities have started to allocate funding, and also President Biden's administration have unlocked a lot of different funding opportunities to continue to fund these necessary programs. And so what's great about these programs is there is a wide variety of programs that localities can choose from, whether it's hospital-based, whether it's social service-based.
Finally, it is Gun Violence Awareness Month. It is this weekend. We will be wearing orange for Gun Violence Awareness Weekend and Gun Violence Awareness Day. But this is in awareness of all gun violence in all its forms and all victims. But it was really started after a young lady named Hadia Pendleton was killed. Her birthday was June 2nd, and her friends started wearing orange. And she played at President Obama's inauguration, his second inauguration in 2013 in her band, and then was killed not too long after that in a park in Chicago. So it was really this Wear Orange awareness was born out of the impacted communities violence that we're talking about right now. So June 5th also which is where Orange Day this year, is Breonna Taylor's birthday. So as a young Black female, both of these young ladies, they were around the same age. They were they were killed by needless gun violence. So what does, for you personally and as a movement and in this work, what does honoring their lives and legacies look like to you? And what can we as a movement do to lift up the voices of young African-American women and activists all over this country?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andrew, for that question. And so, as you said, Hadia Pendleton and Breonna Taylor both gone too soon for different types of gun violence that disproportionately impact communities of color. And so, last year, this time, I know we were thinking about Breonna Taylor's birthday, and I wrote the open letter to Breonna on our Medium blog. And so, in reflection, as we're here a year later and we've seen the cries for racial justice, we've had now the conviction of Derek Chauvin. But one of the things that definitely stays on my mind is the lack of justice oftentimes that we see for Black women, particularly. And so as I continue to wear orange, I lift up Breonna Taylor's name and also Hadia Pendleton, but Tatiana Jefferson and Sandra Bland and countless others who continuously continue to lose their lives, whether it's due to interpersonal or community violence and or police violence. And so what I think I will continue to do is use my platform to make sure that Black women and girls specifically are centered in our movement as it relates to gun violence, and then making sure that we continue to push the policies at all levels to actually create the structural change. So whether it's the George Floyd and Policing Act, or whether it's working with states and localities to allocate funding for these evidence-based programs, I think where we are at in our movement really is an inflection point as we continue to grapple with the structural inequities, the uptick in violence, ongoing police violence, and the need for resolution. And so what I really see my charges for the next year is to make sure that communities are still able to define their own safety, and that hopefully we can educate individuals on how to not make mistakes that maybe we've made before as it relates to when we see this upticks in violence, is not thinking about the long-term impacts of some of the policies and budget cuts. And there's been a lot of talk around, well, what are we going to do to address this violence? We know what works. And I know sometimes that it's very easy to go back to what we know in these situations, which is over policing communities that are already over policed. And so really making sure that I am amplifying the voices of all communities of color, but particularly making sure that women of color are centered in that, and that communities are the ones that are really leading the charge on what the solutions that I continue to advocate for.
Well, thank you so much for all your work. It's so important, and it's really making a difference. Lauren Footman, thank you so much. Take care, and we will talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew.